Okay, that was a struggle. It is 4:42 East Coast time. Apologies for all of the technical difficulties. We were trying to figure out some stuff, but I'm gonna dive right in. As people get the new link, if they wanna chime in, ask questions, come and view, that's fine. This will also save so people can view it later. So the conversation I was asked to talk about, or the topic, is processing bias or race-related incidents that impact campus climate in college communities, specifically thinking about predominantly white institutions, which I'll call PWIs, for those of you who are not familiar with the acronym. I want to reframe the conversation a little bit. I think bias and race-related incidents are really nice terms that we use, but in order to have a real honest dialogue about how we process these moments and the movements, we must name what we're really talking about. And what we're really talking about is racism on the micro and the macro level. We are talking about how to process the sometimes fatal acts of racism enacted on and experienced by individuals, specifically Black and brown people, either at a systemic level or in an interpersonal interaction. I want to start by reading a demand from my students here at Wesleyan University, and then dissecting that a little bit, understanding that while we often talk about communities as bubbles, right, especially at a small private liberal arts institution, we are deeply impacted by and participating in the systems of oppression and racism, higher ed especially, specifically predominantly white institutions, considering the history of many of our institutions. So my students gave a list of demands last semester, like many students across the nation were doing, specifically Black students were doing, and in their statement, in their demands, they asked for a statement of accountability, demanding that the president in 48 hours respond to their demands and commit to addressing some of their issues in a specific deadline. In that statement of accountability, the students wrote, failing to reach out to the student of color community, Black and brown students when campus controversies that directly affect us occur, failing to reach out to the student of color community regarding the Argus article controversy, perpetuating the devaluation of Black and brown lives by failing to address the Wesleyan community and express sympathy and compassion when international tragedies occur outside of Europe. January 2015, Michael Roth sent personal emails to French students expressing condolences in regards to the Charlie Hebdo shooting. April 2015, no campus update or email of the condolence was sent in response to the Kenyan tragedy at the Garissa University. November 2015, no message of condolence was sent in response to attacks in Beirut, Lebanon. November 2015, Michael Roth sent a campus update expressing solace and confirming all students in Paris study abroad programs are safe in regards to the attack in Paris. So what we need to think about is how we as administrators and as institutions in general are acknowledging even acts of racism and violence experienced specifically by Black and brown people versus violence enacted on predominantly white bodies, and how what warrants a university's response, what warrants a statement from a president, and then how can we process these events when we're not even acknowledging that they happened in the first place, right? And so that's kind of the framework for thinking about some of this. What we had in the past year and a half, 2 years, was a non-indictment in the murder of Michael Brown, a non-indictment in the murder of Eric Garner. We had the SAE chant on the bus in Oklahoma. We had, Tamir Rice, 12 years old, shot in a park. We had Martice Johnson beat by campus or security or whoever who was, an involved student leader. And those were just some of the high profile cases that people had their ear to the ground on. And maybe people even didn't. Maybe because I'm a Black woman, I knew that was happening, and maybe other folks are not aware that that was happening. But those were just some of the more publicized cases that got attention. Meanwhile, not only Black men were experiencing violence on and off our campuses, but Black and brown women, especially trans women of color, have been facing unacknowledged violence. And so what my students pose in their demands, and what we must all ask, is whose pain, struggle, experience with violence, physical or not, right? That not all violence is physical violence. What deserves a response, action, and processing, right? And what spaces do we give for that to happen? And how do we as administrators and institutions address that pain and process together? I think what happened in Missouri at Mizzou with Concerned Student 1950 is that they created, not created, but brought to light a lot of the issues happening on predominantly white campuses to a national level that inspired other students to kind of engage in this conversation about how our institutions are not meeting the needs of historically underrepresented and marginalized students, that being Black and brown students, first-generation students, low-income students, queer students, trans students, women, in all of those instances, right? So thinking about that, some things I can offer is that while we think about processing as community, it's also important to know that we don't have to process as a community. Sometimes we don't need to all be together in our process and processing. Creating spaces where students feel comfortable to be in their anger, to be in their pain, to name their frustration is really important. Affinity spaces are really important, and white people should also have affinity spaces. Men should have affinity spaces. Straight people should have affinity spaces. That's important as you are grappling with some bigger issues, right? Some themes around the ways in which we may have been socialized, whether in our privilege or in our marginalization, right? Thinking about, grappling with some of those bigger issues as we see ourselves in either victims of violence or the people who are enacting the violence, right? And working through that. And sometimes we don't need to be in mixed company processing through that, because the process for a white man in grappling with the Charleston shooting might have a negative impact on my process as a Black woman processing that same thing, right? And so understanding that affinity spaces are not bad, they are great spaces, separate is good sometimes, and that it will allow space for folks to either decide or not decide, right? That they can come back together then and discuss or process together, or whatever it is that your community as a whole might need. The second thing that I can offer is administration and institutional leaders, you specifically. You don't need to know everything, right? You don't have to have all of the answers, right? And so what we saw the past 6 months at many of our institutions was students listing demands of their administrators and of their community. And what I noticed was many leaders of institutions needing to come with a response, needing to have something to say, needing to, quickly come up with a plan. And what we find is that many of us, especially as we climb the hierarchical ladder of higher education, feel less comfortable being vulnerable, especially with our students. And so being vulnerable, showing your community, I don't think is a bad thing. I think saying, I'm not sure what we're gonna do about that. Those are really great points that you raise. Let's work together as a community to address some of these issues, right? I think those are some authentic ways that we can build together as communities, right? As we're processing these events, I don't expect the white, straight, male leader of my institution to have all the answers about how to make this place better for Black, queer women students. And I wouldn't want him to pretend that he did, right? And so I think we need to be okay with not having all of the answers and allowing space, not only for our students to process, but for ourselves as staff and administrators to also process, because we are also impacted by the things going on in our world and going on our campuses. And it's important for us to also carve out space and time to say, I don't know how I'm doing with all of this. I'm trying to be supportive. I'm trying to get support. And I don't know what that looks like here, right? But if we can communicate and work together, then you can get to a place where maybe your students feel more comfortable, more safe, and feel like they really belong in a space, right? The last thing that I have to offer as an idea of thinking about processing is gather your community and make a plan, right? I find that being on this hierarchy, it often falls to the people in the top ranks, right? The president's cabinet, the people who have his ear, to develop committees and plans and you know, research strategies and things like that. And what I value about Wesleyan especially is their ability to engage students in the dialogue, which I did not see often in the past while I was working at other institutions or while I was in school myself. And yes, I believe there are very specific students chosen sometimes to sit on those boards and to sit at those tables. But what is important is that there is space there for all voices to be heard, right? That the hierarchy that exists is one that we can kind of dismantle by allowing space for all voices and all experiences around the table, right? If you are planning to develop a multicultural center, or if you are planning to have a discussion about Ferguson or about, you know, Paris attacks, like, it would probably behoove you to have people who have some insight and knowledge and experience and identities connected to those places, spaces, and moments in our history, right? So I think that's really important in thinking about what has happened the past year at your institution, and who is leading the conversation about how to address some of those problems. And if the answer is, you know, the president of the university, and not the people that it's directly affecting, then we should go back and think about bringing some other voices to the table, right? Bringing some other voices and experiences and ideas to the table. We must be very critical of predominantly white institutions as we toss around words like diversity and inclusion without discussing the very history and structure that's been brought to the places in which we work. And the places where we are now needing to think about inclusivity, right? This word is a really nice buzzword that's being used, is starting to be used more and more and more. And that's exactly what it is a buzzword, because when we talk about inclusion, and we don't talk about who we're including and including them into what. And so that's something that we really need to kind of flesh out a little bit. Knowing that at the very foundation of most of our institutions, specifically predominantly white institutions, the history is that Black and brown folks were not accepted and not welcome. Women were not accepted and not welcome. Queer folks were not accepted and not welcome. If you were poor, you definitely weren't going, right? And so while we talk about inclusion, we have to think about, are we trying to include these historically marginalized populations into institutions that were built on white supremacist culture, right? Patriarchal culture, male culture. Thinking about these institutions were specifically for land-owning, wealthy, white, straight men or closeted men. And is that what we're including them into? Or are we really trying to dismantle and reframe and rebuild our institutions? And so thinking about that is, you know, what does that processing look like of race-related incidences or bias when at the foundation of your institution is white supremacy and patriarchy, right? How do you process those events in those moments when the institution in and of itself is not a space that was created for you to do that? which is why multicultural centers are still so valuable and so very important, because our institutions as a whole have not yet figured out how to, in and of itself, be a place where all people feel like they belong and can talk and be authentic. And so we have these pockets of communities that still exist because our institutions haven't yet gotten to that place where the processing can happen at a macro level, institutional level. It happens in pocketed communities. So, you know, what does it look like for me as a Black queer woman to process, you know, the murder of a 12-year-old boy in a park at the hands of law enforcement at a predominantly white institution built on the assumption of my inferiority and non-belonging? And what I wrote, you know, I wrote for the Student Affairs Collective in December of 2014, and it was shortly after the non-indictment in Mike Brown, and the grand jury chose not to indict. And what I wrote was that, you know, I'm struggling as a young Black woman. I'm struggling with how to support my students, how to care for myself, how to talk to my 7-year-old brother about the realities of his identity. I am challenged on how I can strategically hold my colleagues and institution accountable and committed to addressing the ways in which we have been systemically oppressing minoritized populations. I'm trying to balance making waves without burning bridges. I'm exploring what justice and equity can look like on this campus and how we can create that. And so that little blurb really gets to the point, right? And so thinking about, are we just talking about justice and equity? Because in order to have spaces where folks feel like they can process events of racism and violence, there has to be some kind of conversation about equity, right? Is this an equitable space? Am I given the same treatment in the same space and the same time and energy as the French students when the Paris attack happened, as, you know, French students from Charlie Hebdo happened, as my students mentioned in their demands that I read to you before? You know, this idea that the administration only release statements, only checks in on certain populations of students and not others, right? When other tragedies happen around the world or right in our own backyards. And also thinking about staff, right? Do staff even get acknowledgement? Do staff even get a check-in? Do we get space to process and to really feel our feelings and then move to a place of action and supporting our students in their own action, right? And what does that look like? I continued to write, this is more than an 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. It's about my life, my humanity, and citizenship. It is about justice and freedom. This is more than work, but it is work. It's hard work, and it's lifelong work. I urge us to all look inward at our own roles and responsibility to creating change at our institutions. I beg us to look outward and see the pain that many in our community are experiencing. I hope we are taking care of ourselves and each other and using this as a catalyst to change our institutions, our communities, and the world. As you start or continue the dialogue with students, I would encourage us to begin by asking the question, what do you need? I think that is a huge part of the processing that needs to happen for a lot of folks on campus. And I'll be working with some women of color here in our community this weekend on processing around sexual violence specifically, but you know, the same can be said for race incidents and bias incidents. Thinking about what do communities need, right? What do our Black male students need? What do queer students need? What do our trans staff need, if you have any, right? Because they're not very visible at our institutions. And so thinking about what do we need in order to be able to process, right? Process through our pain, our struggle, our confusion, our frustration, right? And then what do we need in order to move forward, right? In order to move forward in action, because I think the processing is important. And then what do you do with that when it's done, right? What do you do when you've gotten to a place where you're comfortable, where you're feeling more secure, where you're feeling like you have gotten to a place where you're more grounded, but you see the need for change, right? In your processing, you've discovered some gaps, you've discovered some holes, you've discovered some disparities. You've discovered some ways that you are experiencing violence, right? Maybe it's not physical violence, but maybe it's microaggressions. Maybe it is a slant, or maybe it is a hierarchy that's been imposed on you. Maybe you're feeling like you're not being heard. And that goes for students, staff, faculty, whoever, right? And so thinking about some of that and how we can get to a place where that processing moves to action, right? Moves to how can we then make our communities better, right? How can we live in and act out in the way that we wish the rest of the world was? And so that's some of my points on processing racism. And I see a few people tuned in, and I don't know if there's a way to ask questions. I don't even know how this works. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. I know it's being recorded, so folks who missed out or are tuning in late can definitely go back and check in with what was said and have some conversations around that. I am just checking to see if there's a question thing. I'm sure you all can tell that I've never used this before. Chat box on the side, thank you. I do see that. So for anyone here, opening Q&A, great. Hey, Bulaong, can you discuss what programming institutions can do, more so focusing on engaging students in regards to addressing campus climate issues or events? What have you seen done well? How do you maintain civil discourse? Sorry, lots of questions. That's great. Some of the great programming that I've seen, and a lot of it is being done, I like to use, and maybe I'm a little biased, my first position out of grad school was at the University of Kansas in their Office of Multicultural Affairs. They have an amazing staff there that is really committed to social justice. And so what happened actually after Ferguson is that we planned an open forum. We had an hour lunch conversation, invited the campus community. We had a professor moderate, people came, they asked questions, they debated, it was a really great dialogue, and it was the first of many that have occurred from then on. And so I find open forums to be really great, with an understanding that they are open, right? So everyone is invited and included. And then there were very specific affinity programs. So women of color developed a group, and they've been getting together and talking with one another. There have been programs around, for some of our more legal-minded folks, right? Bringing in lawyers to talk about some of the issues with police brutality from a legal perspective, bringing in social scientists to talk about the social science of it, bringing in historians to talk about the history of it. Engaging with academic departments has been really great, because one, what happens is academic departments tend to get students who typically will not go to these kinds of conversations because it either doesn't pertain to them, or because it takes up time, they're not getting any credit. And so this is a way for, if you plan it far enough in advance, or have a faculty that's engaged enough, might offer extra credit for students to go attend a dialogue. So I find open forums and dialogues to be really, really awesome. The other thing that I've noticed that's sometimes very damaging but can be beneficial is Twitter conversations. A lot of my students have been engaging in conversations via a hashtag, right? So they'll develop a hashtag and engage in a dialogue on that hashtag. Yes, you get internet trolls and all sorts of kind of violent, awful, terrible messages, because Twitter can be a terrible space. But in general, I think our students have really been able to connect, and have been able to connect nationally with other students who are dealing with some similar issues, and brainstorming ways in which they can kind of combat and engage in dialogue on their respective campuses. In terms of campus climate issues or events, it really depends on the issue. I think our campus climates are similar across the nation in the sense that there are students who are upset, unsafe, and uncomfortable on their campuses. The identities of those students may be different in different places. What I think is important is making sure that administrators are aware of what's going on, of how students are feeling, that students have a space where they feel like they can express that and express themselves, and that we are thinking about what kind of policies, what kind of structures do we have in place that may not be beneficial for the entire community. And so I think a lot about how some structures and policies that we have are not necessarily accessible to all students, especially if they have certain identities or certain needs on campus. We have a reporting system that students have that no one knew about until students made demands, and then the institution was like, oh, but we have this way you can report things, and everyone was like, oh, that would have been great to know. Even I, as a staff person, had never heard of it, right? And so how are we communicating the resources we do have, and how are we acknowledging what we don't have, and thinking about ways in which we can develop new programs and policies and resources for our students? How do you maintain civil discourse? I don't. I hate civil discourse. I hate the word civility. It really bothers me because who gets to decide what is civil, right? I think that term civility is rooted in a lot of respectability and white supremacy, to be honest, right? I think civil for Donald Trump is probably not the same thing as civil is for me. Or maybe it is, I don't know. So I think thinking about how we're framing that, right, how we're defining some of these terms is really important in deciding what is civility, who gets to decide what is civil, right? If I, as a Black woman, say something passionately and someone labels that as aggressive and uncivil, is that because it was aggressive and uncivil, or is that because someone is labeling me as an angry Black woman, right? And so we have to think about the way in which folks have been socialized to view certain people, and engaging in dialogue, how that may show up, and how that may paint the way in which we're engaging in discourse with other people. I think speaking passionately and is really important, and speaking loudly is not necessarily uncivil, right? And like people speaking expressively with their hands, which I do all the time, and that may be very off-putting for some people. So I think being transparent with that, right? Saying, I talk really loudly, I cuss a lot when I speak, that is not uncivil, that's just how I express myself. I hope everyone is okay with that, just putting it out on the table, right? And so getting to a place where we feel comfortable doing that with other people, and knowing that we can name some of our qualms and some of our little habits, hoping that folks don't look at that as representative of any one of our identities, rather than the way in which we just engage in dialogue that we feel passionate about. I hope that answered your question. This is so very high tech. I'm very impressed. Are there any other questions or thoughts? I see there's a couple more viewers that tuned in. Anything specific that you all are thinking about or interested in discussing, or hear me discuss? I think you can type in questions and I can see them. Great. I know we're running a little behind because of our technical difficulties. Apologies for that. Google has a monopoly on all things cool in terms of technology, and I've never used this before. This was new for me, so I feel like I learned something new today. Any other questions? Well, if there are no other questions, That was it. I'll leave you with just the quick bullet points for those of you who may have tuned in late. The 3 things I offered in terms of processing racism was, you know, you don't all need to process together. Oh, there is a question. I will get to that. Admin and institutional leaders, it's okay to be vulnerable. And then gather your community and plan together, students, faculty, staff. I'm even thinking about how I leave out custodial staff, right? Our food workers, right? How are these things impacting them in their lives? How are they impacted by our students on campus? And so, you know, those are some things to just think about. What should be a response towards, we have done this before, what about getting staff or faculty buy-in? So the "we have done this before" comment is a very interesting one, because if we have done this before and it was successful, then we wouldn't need to be doing it again, right? And my partner and I both do social justice work. I feel like it's very dark in here. There we go. My partner and I both do social justice work, and you know, it was funny, yesterday we were talking and he did a session with some students, and someone said to him, you know, if you keep doing sessions like this, you're gonna be out of a job, right? And we were like, we would love to be out of a job. We would love to not ever have to talk about social justice and equity and white supremacy and, you know, all of the isms ever again, right? That means that we did something right and people are actually getting their shit together. Like, that would be awesome. I would love to not have to do that. But the fact that we keep having to do this means that we're not doing something right. Like, we're not getting something quite right. And I really do think at the foundation of it is that we are not having real honest dialogue, right? We're not really talking about the issues. We're talking around the issues, right? We're talking about building cultural centers and hiring, you know, equity advocates and directors of multicultural affairs, which is great and dandy, but the foundations of our institutions are still rooted in white supremacy and white supremacist culture and the heteropatriarchy, and we're transphobic and we're homophobic, and, you know, women are still experiencing violence at the utmost degree. Like, it's unbelievable, right? And so the fact that we're still having these conversations means we've done this before, but we didn't do it that great. We didn't do it that well, and we need to do it again, right, to be frank. And I think having that conversation is really important, and feeling comfortable with saying that too, you know. You know, there's some things that maybe we need to think about doing differently, right? Maybe having a little different conversation. A more honest conversation. Oh, you're welcome, Amanda. When trying to engage student staff in having these conversations, what would be the best approach for them when addressing their peers? Oh, student staff are really hard, because typically we have these conversations with student staff during training, right? And so they're not necessarily wanting to be there in this conversation, right? They're not choosing to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion and race incidents and things like that. Typically, they're required to be there, and we include these conversations as a part of their training. And so it can be a real struggle to get them engaged. What I like to do is I really like to think about the way students experience oppression and the way students experience privilege. For white students, it can be really, really challenging for them to understand, you know, the difference between their varied identities. What you'll find, especially with white women, right? They'll talk about racism as if they experience it because of they're white, but really what they're experiencing is misogyny because they're women, but they don't have the language or the understanding of the systems to name that. And so getting people to a place where, one, they have language, right? They have language and understanding. Two, that they get past whatever guilt they may be feeling, right? Whatever they they've been socialized to feel, and move to a place where they understand that their situation and understanding of the world and socialization is not their fault. They're a product of their environment and the world that they live in, as we all are. And then 3, getting personal with them, getting them to think about, you know, their best Black friend or their gay uncle or, you know, whoever it may be, and trying to get them to see the humanity in those people and in their experiences, and understanding that the actions that we see, right, on a systemic level that we see because we have probably a bird's eye view of some things, right? The incident with Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin and Rekia Boyd, right? These might just be individual people to them. That has nothing to do with their best friend who's Black. That would never happen to them, right? But getting them to understand the connection between that, right? It's absolutely possible. Yes, why is that? This person didn't have any information about their history, their schooling, their knowledge, their whatever, right? And having a real dialogue, because I think it's hard to grapple with some of the greater systemic issues when it's not personal, right? When it's not personal. And I think addressing their peers, like, we have to instill in our students some courage, right? It takes a lot of courage to be able to address your peers, to stand up and say, hey, what you said was kind of offensive, or, you know, maybe you could think about, you know, not saying those jokes around me, or not saying that stuff around me, or however, you know, whatever the incidents may be. All of that takes courage, right? And we can't practice, as Maya Angelou says, any other virtue without courage, right? Because it takes courage to be able to practice that constantly, right? In your meetings, in your classroom, with your friends, with your family. Like, in order to constantly practice any other virtue, you have to have courage. You have to. So I think instilling that in our students. Let's see, you just released campus climate data. We don't have any campus climate data. We're supposed to be getting some campus climate data here, hopefully soon. Are there any other questions? I know there are a couple more people tuned in. Thinking about processing instances of racism. I've also talked a little bit about sexism, misogyny, homophobia. In an effort to be the forever learner, I am. Any books, suggestions to assist in this area that you found helpful? Yes. Oh, I love book suggestions. I'm actually reading a ton of, or trying to read a bunch of books. Well, let me offer some authors that I find very valuable. And something that bothers me about higher ed is that we always want to suggest, like, books centered around higher education. What I find really valuable is novels written from, like, by identities that you don't necessarily have. And I'm reading a bunch that I actually identify with, because I got to read a bunch of white people when I was in school. So now I'm reading a bunch of Black queer women. And so I would definitely encourage Melissa Harris Perry. I just got her book, and so far it's amazing. Angela Davis, obviously, and Bell Hooks are both really great in terms of talking about systems and analyzing the systems in which we live in. They are both Black women, Black queer women, and so they have a perspective that doesn't actually get talked about a lot in our institutions, which is part of the problem, right? Is that we are not, we're not given opportunities to really hear and learn from the voices of Black people, Black women, Black queer women, and that really hinders our ability to then see them as full, capable human beings, right? And so I would definitely encourage those 3 books. I was also just given this book, which I haven't read yet, Difficult Conversations. How to Discuss What Matters Most. And it's by Stone, Patton, and Heen. So Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. And I was just given this book, and I haven't been able to read through it too much, but some of the sections that I was encouraged to read talk about intent versus impact, and then getting started, right? Creating a learning conversation, right? Getting started, beginning from the third story, listening from the inside out, right? And so thinking about conflict resolution, we just did a here, and what, you know, my supervisor talked to me about it. I was unable to attend, and said what the speaker was saying was that, you know, these conversations or conflict resolution are not intended to give you the best results, but to get you to the result that you need. And that may not be the best outcome, right? That may not be what you have in mind when you think about conflict resolution in terms of divorce, right? The best result by the standard would be you stay together and stay happy and married. But what you might need is not to be together or be happy and married, right? And so thinking about some of that in the way in which we engage in dialogue, I think, around race and racism is, we're not trying to make everyone be best friends, but we want everyone to have an honest dialogue with one another, where they also feel physically safe, right? I don't like the idea of safe spaces, but physically safe. But people should be uncomfortable, absolutely. And so yeah, definitely Melissa Harris Perry, Angela Davis. I just finished reading The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is amazing. I had never read it before, but it's a really great book in terms of thinking about the way in which white supremacy impacts specifically Black children. And I could see so much of myself and my own upbringing, and even the struggles that my students are going through in that book. So novels are definitely a great way to think about learning and getting an insight on the experiences of other people, even though they are not necessarily autobiographical. They do have some serious impact in truth. Are there any other thoughts, questions? This is my first Google Air live thing. It's very exciting. Is anyone having any other struggles on their campus in having conversations around racism or bias incidents that they themselves need to process through or have questions about? All right. Well, if that's it, I will offer you all. I am on Twitter at Bulaong, BULAONG _Ramiz, RAMIZ. I am on Twitter, so definitely check me out, follow me, engage in a dialogue. I'm on there often, chit-chatting away. I was just, you know, following up on Kanye and Amber Rose and their recent drama. So I like to talk about racism and terrible, awful things, and also very fun things. So definitely follow me if you have some more questions or thoughts or want to engage in a conversation out of this forum. I am definitely always available there. So it has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. If there are no other questions, I have a bunch of students waiting for me. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope to connect with some of you off of the Google Hangout at some time. Thanks again. Bye.